Good morning, Cleo.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me.
You're welcome.
So obviously I have many questions for you because it's been an extraordinary year so far and you've done a lot. So just to introduce you, you're a performer, a dancer, but also an activist. And obviously everybody knows you for having been the Lord Mayor of Bristol. You've also been involved in politics. You're a Green activist and you worked with the Green Party as a candidate, and I think you might be a candidate again for the
I'm
Logan.
actually a Green Party councillor in Bristol, so I'm on the Bristol City Council.
Yes, exactly. Wonderful. And also now you're launching your own podcast. So
Yeah,
do you want to start with that and let us know why you needed this platform, and then we can go over your activism, especially on the green campaigning for the climate crisis, and a little bit more about your next project.
sure. So African AF is a concept that I came up with the last time I was in Ghana. So I was in Ghana for quite a few weeks actually, and I came back at the end of January. And during that time, obviously, I connected with people I already know, dance artists, people who curate festivals, etc. But I also met new artists, musicians, and I thought I wanted a way to bring together the people that I'd met in Ghana and also the people that I work with here or that I know of here, and also to be kind of forward thinking in terms of identity, and to put at the heart of identity and that message of Africanness, and to be able to reclaim that as someone from the diaspora. So African AF, actually, if I backtrack, it was actually Jadena, who is a music artist in America. And he was actually over there last year as well, because it was the year of return. So Ghana promoted the year of return last year, encouraging people from the diaspora to go back to Ghana. So they actually attracted millions of people from the diaspora. And how that came about in terms of year of return was that it was 400 years to the year of people being enslaved and taken to the Americas. Of course, there was things that happened prior to that, but that's an acknowledged moment in history. And equally, places like Virginia, which are deeply connected historically to Bristol, they also commemorated their 400 years. So during all that, and sometime last year, I was kind of online. I must have came across Jadena, he's a well-known musician, but he's also an activist. And he was speaking on a panel, and he was talking about fashion, culture, coming from an American perspective. And he would say, as African Americans, we love our prints, we love our designer labels and the various different brandings, and all of that is African as beep. And I thought, yeah, I can see that. And he was really promoting this idea of what people see as Black culture in the Western world. The essence of it is African. And he was celebrating that fact, and it really resonated. And I thought, African AF, people can make what they want out of the words, but for me, it's not the swear word, but there's an element of that. It's African as future. So it's that belief that my future, my children's future, the way I think about the world has to connect with Africa. And that doesn't mean we all have to go back to Africa. It would be great if we could all visit at least. The world is getting more accessible through this time, through being able to work virtually and connect virtually. But for me, you can be an African and you can celebrate African culture wherever you are in the world.
Well, I certainly agree, because as you know, I've lived in East Africa and Central Africa myself, simply as a reporter, but my family comes from North Africa, and I've been lucky to go from 8 months old. Then I couldn't go for a longer period because there was some sort of civil war. And then I've been lucky to meet some friends from Tunisia and Morocco. So I've been to all parts of Africa. And I think that a lot of people don't realize how much link they have with Africa. I mean, there's recent documentaries and books have shown us that the history goes back to the Roman Empire. So I'm just trying to raise awareness on this issue. now we're in a very big time for change, a pivotal moment. We come out of the coronavirus crisis, and it's extremely important for anything you do with the environment. But I guess the two issues are very much linked. And in my point of view, they are, because all the climate activists in the north of the planet forget that the people suffering the most from them, from problems, are usually in the country that we call the global south, whether Latin America or obviously parts of Asia and Africa. So for you, as such a person who has such a deep knowledge of the history of Bristol and all these connections with those parts of the world, how do you manage to juggle all these cards? I mean, do you also campaign for green activism when you go to Ghana? And do you manage to touch people who are not really feeling they're in touch with Africa on some other level? So how do you manage to take that together?
Yeah, I try as much as I can to hold discussions and get involved with debates, etc., that are happening when I'm in Ghana. And I think just having dialogues and trying to subtly present another worldview is part of it, actually, because activism can be on a very individual, small scale, or it could be larger. I'm also a member and now the regional coordinator for Greens of Colour. So that is also an important platform that seeks to extend the movement, the green movement really, and the climate emergency movement to as wide range as people as possible. We're often kind of told, or it's presented sometimes in the media, that people of colour or global South heritage are not involved in the climate movement. And of course, we know that to be completely false. When people are seeing the destruction of their environment, their homelands, when they're being displaced, when they're experiencing flooding, as we've just seen in India, and all of these different things, people's lives are up against every day climate issues. I think what comes to mind actually is seeing yesterday, for example, how now non-essential shops have been opened off the back of this lockdown period of COVID-19. And the disappointment I felt seeing queues and queues of people to consume items that are not the best quality, that are not designed to last. They are just throwaway. Of course, we know that for some people, that is all they can afford, and they do need items. So there is that element. But also we have to consider the detrimental effect on the environment of this kind of throwaway culture, and also consider people who are making these clothes are not far off from being enslaved, really. And I think all of that is important, and it's all about raising awareness. I'm really encouraged over the last week or so, listening to some of our younger people in the Black community and their understanding of things, and hearing them talk about things like food sovereignty, being able to grow our own food and to have it organic, because one young person heavily believed that the food that we consume that has been genetically modified or whatever else is designed to kill us, really. So it's encouraging for me to see young people framing those arguments. And of course, as I say to other people, you never know what discussions people are having in their homes, when they used to go to the pub, for example, the community centre, all these other places that people gather. They discuss things, they discuss the issues. And I think I would like to see in this time more of those people being able to be less underground and come out a bit more with their views, because their views are really important.
Yes, of course, and there are some sort of ambassadors for some part of the communities in the city that are constantly discouraged to take part into that debate. So that's brilliant. What kind of platforms do you think you have here around you? Obviously, we're in Bristol, as a councillor, as an activist, to, like, for instance, organise events. Despite the challenges that we face, we can't easily invite people to go out and gather in one place. So you have so many projects. Can you mention, for instance, what you believe is what is the most useful for the summer and how we can participate?
Yeah, I'm also a member of Sheba Ensemble, which is a theatre troupe, but we also produce. So we just finished 3 consecutive Saturdays of the Fly Festival of Black Women's Film. We launched this last year, excuse me, with the Fly Festival of Black Women's Theatre. Just take a drink.
Yes.
And I plan to do theatre and film this year in venues like Arnold Feeney, etc. But we've adapted. Can we pause a second because I need to cough?
Sure. That's fine.
Yeah, so we plan to come back with that this year, around this time actually. We were going to launch it, but we've adapted. So we've just run 3 consecutive Saturdays of Fly Festival of Black Women's Film. Week 1, we had films by female directors from Canada and America. The second week was Australia, New Zealand, and our final week, last Saturday gone, was UK and Europe. So through that, we not only screened short films and a feature film, but we had a dialogue after every film, really. And we also had a creative intervention to kind of really try and express what our feelings were from watching the films and with everything that's going on. So I think that was actually a really good way of bringing people together to articulate how they're feeling and also to discuss potential avenues of change. So that was just one element that we've managed to do on an online forum, discussion forum. And we'll be back again this week to deliver one of our theatre productions via Zoom as well, which we're looking forward to. And equally, the other organisation, Black Artists on the Move, have been doing similar work, bringing people together online, because that's something that we were doing before COVID anyway, given that we're an international company and we work with artists all over the diaspora. So we've had to kind of use Zoom anyway to include them in our live events. Beyond that, again, going back to the podcast, you know, over the last week, and I've experienced this before in my career, you know, you'll get last minute requests to do an interview, speak to press, write an article. I can really appreciate now people who can bang articles out week on week, because it can be quite difficult. But I really felt that actually it is great to, and I'm really happy to be on your podcast, because I see you as an independent journalist doing really good work. But in terms of the mainstream, I would rather not be jumping and skipping to their tune, which is why I've launched the podcast as well, so that I can have an opinion, have a voice, and have agency in terms of getting that out.
I think this is extremely important that you say that, because I see a lot of other artist activists who are more in the mainstream, you know, just be around and be telling their opinion about recent changes, racism, education, in channels that they know they cannot control, and media that are just basically getting on the bandwagon, as we say in English, whenever it's convenient, and make no commitment to change on the long run. And so I believe that we live in a time where people need to be in control of the narrative. So I've been trying to explain that to a lot of my friends who are like writers and photographers. For instance, Cleo doesn't need to be taken a photograph of her by you, because she's an artist. She can maybe create something. She doesn't need to wait until she's asked for an interview, because she can launch her own podcast. And to me, one of the big part of Black Lives Matter compared to other events in history about empowering people from what we call here minority, and I just hate that word minority. I think no one's a minority. Most people have been displaced. They haven't chosen to be born in Europe. Even the Europeans haven't chosen either to be born in Europe. But I think it's a disrespectful term. But it's about switching the positions, right? It's about empowering people, giving them the time to express what they want to say in their own time frame. And I think a lot of other people in the city have done the same as you have. Like I'm talking to Dr. Sean Subbers later, and he also refused to comment on the fall of the statue of Edward Colston, which is obviously one of a tiny problem, right, compared to the general issue of how we give enough space for people who have never had any privilege, basically, in this society. So overall, can you just tell us a bit of how you felt during this past 2 weeks? There's been a lot of grief, a lot of disagreement as well. I mean, most of my European friends think we shouldn't protest, that we're always bringing all the problems, we the people of color, we're angry, we want to force change, while, you know, we should be able to be peaceful and patient. But, you know, you're the best person to say how patient African people and Afro-Caribbean people have been. We mentioned 400 years just for the link with one episode in their history. So what were emotionally, how do you cope with it? Because there's so much push and pull and exploitation as well, and this fear of being out of the agenda in just a couple of weeks, when another virus, another problem, another economic crisis, another rush to the fast fashion market will take the lead in the newspaper. So what is your mechanism to cope with that, and how confident do you feel we can bring change on the short term?
I think it's helped having the experience of seeing the first wave of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2016, because I was able to experience it and also experience a kind of backlash from my elders who are long-term activists who campaign for African holistic reparations. At the time, it was difficult because I felt there could have been more support from them, but now I understand a bit more, and the movement Black Lives Matter is global, it's good, and it's absolutely necessary to have protest. But I think it's also important for me to look to those movements that have been consistent for some time, and that look at solutions and that are actively doing that. And sadly, these movements don't achieve or get as much mainstream press. For example, one of the actions over the last kind of, pushed more over the last couple of years, and in line with it being the UN Decade of People of African Descent, is to get the term Afrophobia more widely said, understood, out there, really. You know, we do have Islamophobia, we have other terms, but actually all these things that we're seeing are results of Afrophobia. You have racism, but you also have fear of African heritage people. And this we see very evidently in the justice system or injustice system, however you like to frame it. We see elements of this all day. We heard just a couple of weeks ago on One Extra, actually, a couple of the DJs talking about their experience and how they've had to almost repress their personalities, they've had to withdraw because of how other people are intimidated by them just because this person was a tall Black man, you know? So that is an element of it. So for me, I'm also an advocate ambassador for Stop the Maangamizi campaign, which is a blanket term that incorporates all of these aspects of the harm that has historically been done and continues to be done against African heritage people. And I would love it if all the people who have got behind Black Lives Matter can also get behind that, because part of the push is for holistic reparations. And whilst we see all these institutions now coming out and saying, wow, yeah, Colston was such a bad person, we can't celebrate him. I mean, it's very hypocritical. And of course, would not have it's an important step, but it would not have happened without protest and forced action. You know, when people condemn this, let's also reflect on what some of the aspects of their history might be problematic. We can also reflect on the suffragette movement, who also forced change. They were not, their history has been sanitized, but they were radical. They did use violence and extreme direct action to get the result, and they got the result.
That's an example I always give to my friends, because I do find that women are a bit more involved in all those movements, whether it's on the peaceful side or on the very active side. And I'm like, we as women would never have had the right to vote. How many extraordinary women through times have had a major political role, and that never changed the fact that they couldn't even vote themselves. Also, obviously, I am French, and most of our history, most of the changes have been forced through at least 4 revolutions,
Yeah.
some of them more or less violent, because every time you have a very strong social change, you usually have a backlash. And that happened as much in the UK as well. Like when we changed to a republic, obviously we had the First Empire, and then we had the Second Republic in France, which gave us the Second Empire, responsible for most of the strongest, most violent colonial crimes over 30 years, at least in the last part of the 19th century. So this is to me a big issue. There's also one problem that I see everywhere in Britain, but also even more in France, and I would love to have your opinion on this, is that a lot of people say, I don't see the link between slavery and racism. This was years and years ago. We live in a different society. Let's forget about it. And I even quote someone that I used to study with who has some family from the French Caribbean. She said, I'm not African, I've never been to Africa, it's not my story. African American people should not call themselves African American, and they should move on from the fact that they went through that history, because there's no link with what they live now. I absolutely disagree. I think slavery made racism, and the fact that we forced people to be slaves as taking them from Africa, while before then there were slaves in every society that were just our next door neighbors most of the time, and it was more of a social problem. So how do you manage to educate people about this when there's so much resistance? Do you have special programs that you use, or what is the best for you?
Yeah, it is a challenge, and I think it perfectly demonstrates the element of menticide that's gone on over the centuries, the ingrained attitudes that have been enforced in people's brains, the enslavement of the mind still very much active today. And we have to also consider that, universities and institutions, academia, was set up really to perpetuate the myths, to extend the notion of African heritage people being less than, and that has been, it's only now starting to topple, really. So it's no wonder that some people are not willing to accept the reality of history, because that hasn't been the mainstream narrative until quite recently in some respects. Of course, we can reflect and acknowledge that from the beginning of the colonial operation and enslavement, there has always been resistance. So I think that's important that people recognize that it has always existed. There's always been a battle. Yeah, it's this. It comes back to this Afrophobia and self-hate that people have. Growing up in Bristol, my father was from Jamaica, and he was, and I'm sure he would describe himself if he was here, but I would describe him as an African man born in Jamaica. He was very in tune with his Africanness, and he celebrated it. However, at that time in the 80s, that was not the case for every person from Jamaica. In fact, we kind of had this sense and line delivered to us that, and we kind of saw it parodied on comedy shows like Desmond's, which was set in a barbershop in Camberwell or Peckham on TV, that Africans and Jamaicans hate each other. Okay, that was something that was promoted almost, going back. And I think we've moved on a hell of a lot since then. People are now claiming their Africanness. I've worked for over a decade with Caribbean elders through dance. And it's been interesting to kind of feel their journey to an extent, because, and again, it's because of the conditioning that happened, sometimes through the church as well, in places like Jamaica. The mental enslavement and a denial of who you are, and the sense of shame. Because sometimes when you ask an elder about their background or their history or just general chit chat, they'll start telling you that, you know, they're Syrian, they're German, they're English, they're Scottish, they're Jewish, they're a whole list of things, and maybe last they're African. Okay, and that's quite sad in some ways. But I'm seeing that being turned around, and no matter what age people are now, especially when we've got our youngsters coming through and claiming their Africanness, it's providing a safe space for people to reframe who they are, you know. So that is encouraging, but we still have some way to go.
On the same issue, there's a beautiful film. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's called Little Senegal by Rashid Bouchareb. And it's the story of a man in Gorée in Senegal, who's a historian in obviously the years of slavery, who wakes up one morning after a dream where he's heard you have to meet the rest of your family. And he decided to travel to Harlem in New York to meet his distant cousin that was taken away. I mean, her branch of the family was taken away from West Africa to the United States of America. And he just go there, and, you know, he's an elder, he's a wise man, heavily educated, right? Because he's taking care of the local museum. But when he arrives in Harlem, he meets this very poor woman, very angry, very, you know, left with a tiny job, and she completely rejects him, says, "You're African, I have nothing to do with you, I'm an American woman." And the film is about how they managed to bond and to reconnect. And I think you know, it's a story that a lot of Europeans don't know, but, you know, how about African American people have always been, you know, taught to feel more American than anything else in the first place. And you know that in America, if you have a drop of black blood, you're black. And there's this sort of conscious that, you know, the whiter you are, the closer you are to being a citizen, a real American person. So there's all this issue around colorism and changing people's hair. I think there's also this great film by Chris Rock about weaves and African hair and why we can't stand the curls and all. So I think that, you know, people need to learn more about this. And I know that it's a very complicated history, but I think people who are not from an African heritage need to learn about this as well, because otherwise nothing could change.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I just wanted to know your point of view and to see how it is for you, because being in this political circle, it's difficult, right? There's not so many people who understand and also don't push you back with their sense of guilt. I feel like we live in a time where people don't want to feel guilty for the past, while bizarrely to me, it's so collective past, you know, as if I meet someone who's Scottish German, they also have ancestors who were slaves or enslavers. So why do you blame yourself? We're just here to change it. We're not here to blame anybody. And the more you resist that, the more you make yourself, you give people a reason to be blamed. So
Yeah.
do you think it's something that is really hard to overcome in politics within your own experience?
Well, just generally, I think people from all backgrounds are suffering with the pain of the past because it hasn't been addressed, and it's kind of that there's been an attempt to bury it, which doesn't work. We know how trauma is inherited, and that probably isn't just for African heritage people. That could be from people with a colonial background. And I did take part in a constellation therapy workshop once, really as an observer, and it was on the theme of colonialism, and it was quite an eye-opener to see that actually most of the people who attended are upper to middle class people who are white European, really grappling with the reality of what has happened in the past and it affecting them quite deeply. So it's something that affects everyone, and Black history is everyone's history, it's world history, and it's for everyone to learn about it. But again, the system has been very successful in hiding the truth and changing the truth in some respects. We're seeing now a wave of, you know, decolonization of the curriculum. And that's really important because it's important that of course important that African heritage people really get a grip and understand that their history started before enslavement, and to appreciate the immense contribution they've made to civilization, which is incredible. There is a sort of activist academic called Paul Obina, who has created, and he's created this some time ago, it must be like over 10 years now. He's got something called the timeline, and it's literally a rollout scroll, and it would probably go from your wall to wall, the scroll, and it charts the history of civilization going way, way, way back. A lot of it will stem to Kemet, which other people will reframe as ancient Egypt, and beyond, the Nile Valley. And it will show people in a very clear, tangible way that that period of enslavement is like an inch on something that is miles and miles and miles long. And it puts it into context. And I think now is the time for people to really drill into that, because I think if we look at the genius that came out of the continent, all of our progress has been stifled. For me, to hold anyone back holds everyone back. And I think to get us back on track, things need to be swung in another direction. It's not about white saviors. It is about allies getting on board, of course, because the work is for all of us. And it's going to be harder and longer and more drawn out if we don't unite for the common goal, which is to have a world that we all deserve. And it shouldn't be one that falls under capitalism. It should be one that is in line with humanity, people, and planet. So that's what I think. In terms of politics, things are getting more diverse now, of course, but it has been slow. It has been slow. And I would like to think that, you know, as I didn't plan to go into politics necessarily, but even when times are challenging, I think and you don't always see the results you want. You can be plugging away for years and it's a drop in the ocean that you don't see the change. But actually now I appreciate more than ever that being in that position and doing the little or the lot that you can is so important in terms of representation, so that other people coming up behind you can see it's possible. And to that end, what I've also, as well as being part of other forums, such as the Stop the Mangamizi campaign and a group called African Connections Consortium, which formed in Bristol in 2016 with a view of power sharing beyond tokenism. So it was kind of geared up once Marvin Rees was elected and other people were elected. I can't say it met all of its aims in those 4 years, but what it is going to go on to do is, in collaboration with the Global African People's Parliament, is to create this Council of African and Caribbean Community Interests in Bristol. So I've been tasked with pulling together the youth wing, which will shadow an elders council. And I think that's really important, the element of self-determination. We can have people like me that go in the system. I work as much in the system as I do out of the system, in fact, more out of the system. And I think it's important that we still push for change institutionally, but as a nation, we also need to be building our own. We need to learn about how little progress we've had really in the past decades, despite all the fight and the struggle, and stop putting all of our eggs in the colonial basket, really. So that's what I'm working on. I'm also setting up something that I've been quite interested to do for some time now, but now it feels the time is more than right to start an online school. And it's going to be called School of IE, which stands for Indigenous Excellence. So again, it goes, and anyone can be Indigenous, really. I mean, a child growing up in Bristol, you could argue, is Indigenous to Bristol. And also looking at it, whilst it will have a strong African influence, there is much to be learned from many cultures across the globe. There will be things that have happened in this country, continue to happen, that are of value to us, if only we can have a spotlight on that history. So the idea of the school is to also share my experience of writing articles, speeches, as well as creative elements, because I think it's also important that the creative nature is not suppressed. So I'll be launching that on the 24th of this month.
Wonderful. Like creating some sort of the next generation training or getting them
That's right.
to
Yeah,
follow.
sharing the work.
Mm,
And also hearing from their perspective, it's really important that people of a certain age don't get, I don't know, stagnant, and that they're able to understand the viewpoint of younger people who will bring
yeah.
another layer of energy and another perspective to the movement.
Yes, and that younger people don't just get overwhelmed because, you know,
Yeah,
some of them are really stressed. They feel this everything's happening at the same time, health crisis, cultural crisis, economic crisis. And I believe the more knowledge you have, the more you can see that this happened in the past, we can overcome. You have to be a responsible citizen through knowledge. You also addressed maybe my last questions. I've read a column this week that stated that we need to stop talking about BAME people and focus only on the B, the black, because it's a specific history. My experience, obviously, having been throughout the world, is that we gain a lot by sharing our different experiences. You mentioned working through constellations. If I'm aware enough, that comes a lot from the sort of traditions of the First Nations, Native American, Indigenous people there, who
yeah,
truly believe that, you know, also remembers the violence of the past, which mirrors what we have discovered in psychology and psychiatry more recently, that is kind of sort of always known. And I think the whole world has learned so much through the experiences of these people, Indigenous people, especially in America, in the Americas in general.
yeah,
And you also mentioned Indian history, which I think we've seen a few writers being extremely powerful on these issues, like Arundhati Roy. So
mm,
I personally kind of like this idea that
mm,
BAME, that we don't have in France or in Germany, that people who come from an Indian, Pakistani colonial background in the UK and people who come from the Afro-Caribbean can find some points to fight together, even if they disagree. Like we know that a lot of Indian Pakistani people have joined the Tory party, while
yeah,
you know, maybe Afro-Caribbean people are more resistant to that. And
mm.
that's great because it means everyone can express their opinion. But I feel like there's a strong divide on that. So do you feel like we need a phase where we actually focus only on like Afro-Caribbean history because it's like an emergency, or do you want to include in your school, as you were just saying, people who have an experience of basically any sort of difference?
Yeah, there's a few threads to that. I'm personally against the term BAME because is it's kind of homogenizing people. And I feel that identities are lost in that term. And we've seen quite clear, some people might get confused and actually say, well, your ethnicity is BAME. Of course, it isn't BAME, but some people will get confused about that.
Mhm.
Um, I think also we've seen through COVID that actually the virus has affected different groups within the bracket of BAME very, very differently. And to lump them all together complicates things and doesn't tell the whole story. Um, I absolutely agree that people should align with each other and understand that with unity, we've got a better chance of toppling the overall systems of power, and to understand generally all of our journeys, our histories, and find our crossing points and our similarities, but also acknowledge that how discrimination and issues play out today is quite different for different communities. I think also it's interesting to reflect perhaps on movements gone by, maybe 60s, 70s, and 80s, where you had a sense of politically black, which did bring in different ethnicities who were not of African heritage directly. Um, Other scholars have done a lot of work in terms of the family tree for all of us, and you can break down and see how African civilization is in these other cultures,
Mm.
which is quite interesting. Um, so yeah, I think we don't want any more divisions, but we have to recognize our own individual struggles. For me, I would say that I care about all people, and as a politician, I have to work for all people, but my drive is for African heritage, and I shouldn't feel awkward about saying or doing that. that's where my loyalties and my passion lies. It's interesting as well because it ties into this idea of identity. And whilst I'm of African heritage, my culture is now different to if I had grown up on the continent, and they're all valid, you know?
Definitely. It's really interesting. Also, I guess in the UK, a lot of people are a mix of things now, right? A lot of people have got Scottish, Caribbean heritage, or even part Asian, and a lot of people can tick any box at all because they're not just simply Asian or black. And if you're from Indonesia or New Zealand, from a Maori background, you don't know where to fit. So people should never made shameful about the complexity and uniqueness of their own journey. And I agree with you that it's a lot about knowledge, but it's really interesting to hear your view because you have so much experience in this.
I think as well, I'd just add that if we look at Europe as well, I sense that actually some people, for me, of course, it's obvious that I'm of African heritage. You know, I can look at you and I can think it's obvious to me that you're of North African heritage. Other people have maybe buried who they are, and that's really sad because that is how society has shaped them. Through persecution, they've had to deny who they are. And I think now is the time to actually come forward and say, no, this is who I am.
And it's also a very European problem because we saw that recently with Brexit, right? There are tensions about, oh, those people are from Poland. And I, as a Mediterranean, I'm like, you know, Polish people and British people seems to have a lot in common, but they just want to look at the difference that people from the northern side of Germany have a different accent from people from the southern part of Germany, Bavaria, and they feel like, oh, we're totally different, we're not Protestants, etc., etc. So Europe has this history of extreme divisions. What happened in the Balkans, what happened in Italy, that unified very late in the late 19th century. So this is a European problem in a way that they've exported everywhere, in Pakistan, India, Palestine, Israel, as in bringing this idea of borders, and where I end is where you begin. Well, actually, I don't believe in that. I believe like it's much more complicated than that. And we all melt, and I think that we should focus on common history and learning from each other. But again, every people has a different experience, and yours has been really, really rich. So I just hope this will reach as many people as possible. If there's anything you'd like to add, please feel free. Otherwise, I'll just thank you very much.
No, happy to be here. Great to talk to you, Melissa. And yeah, just to highlight the podcast African AF, and it is now on Spotify and other platforms. So please check it out and give it a listen as well as this podcast. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cleo, and all the best for all this great project.
I will see you online.
Yeah, definitely.
And hopefully in person soon.
Yes, we will, I guess, well, at some point it will be possible, right?
Okay, have a good week.